All right. Greetings, class. FDED 252, Ethics for Educators. This is the first time I'm recording this is in January the 29th, 2014. So it's possible that I might be using this again as an introduction, although I may not, because the class, as is often the case with my courses, changes from semester to semester. So it may be that I will be once again in the future, at any rate, changing the syllabus. So anyway, I'm here just to give a brief introduction to the course and talk a little bit about the structure of the course as well as the content. So I'm just going to begin by talking through the syllabus that I sent you, and I'm going to actually wait to go through the overview because I want to do that when I talk about the content of the class and what we're talking about. But in terms of the structure, this is a distance learning class, and there are different structures, different ways of doing distance learning. One of them is to do everything online, and that is to say to never see one another face to face. That other version, where you actually get together from occasion, is called hybrid or blended model. And in that case, you might get together once a month or twice a semester and have a seminar, face-to-face seminar, which is a really nice model, which we're not doing, but that's an opportunity. We're doing a model that's sort of the traditional, insofar as you can call distance learning a tradition model, which is all through technology, no face-to-face. And this semester in particular, we're going to try and do something new, which is through the technology and the software that's been made available by Google. We are going to be using the Google Plus Hangout as a way to have real-time online interactive seminars. So as I outlined and detailed in the syllabus, everyone's going to need to have a Gmail account, which if you don't have one already, it's very easy to create one. Just go to gmail.com and create an account. And the way that you can create an account simply for this course. I had a student who did that recently in a course where we used the Google Plus Hangout, and she just made an Gmail account simply for the purposes of using it as a Hofstra student. So you can, and I've recommended this to my undergraduate section that is doing this as well in a hybrid format, and I said you can do something as simple as a nickname or a favorite color or whatever the case, and then add to the name of your account the course. So you could say, for example, green FDED 252 2014 at gmail.com, or you can put your initials, whatever they may be. So in my case, it would be EMD FDED 252 2014 at gmail.com. So it's an easy way to remember your Gmail if you want to create one just for this course, or it could just be your initials, Hofstra student at whatever. Now, I would recommend that, if you want to, or if you have a Gmail account. And then once you have the account set up, you need to email that to me, and then I'm going to create a Google Plus group. Google Plus is kind of Google's version of a social media platform, and I'll create a group for the class. It's going to be called FDED 252 Spring 2014, and then once we're all collected, I'll use the group. I'll invite the group to participate in the Hangouts. Now, the one caveat, as I outlined in the syllabus, is that with the Google Plus Hangout, you need to, there's a maximum of 10 people that can participate. So what we're going to do is we're going to have two sessions, and I detailed that. One that will begin at 7, and the next one that will begin at about 7:40. So it'll be about a half an hour plus to start off with. We'll split it into two sessions of a half hour. So you will reserve a spot in one or the other, and I've already had somebody who emailed me that they want a spot in the 7 o'clock session. So it's very experimental, and that's part of the idea of what we're doing here. The exciting thing about doing this distance learning project for me is that it's new. It's wide open. It's a bold new frontier, and it's something that we should have fun with. We should experiment with, and we should explore. There are different reasons why some of you are taking a distance learning class. One of them has to do with the fact that you might be enrolled in the, as far as I know, the only fully online master's degree at Hofstra. There may be another one, but it was definitely the first one. And so then all your courses are happening through distance learning. You may have professional commitments, family commitments that don't allow you to drive to campus, so a distance learning class works for you. You may have been like a group of students that had to take the class as a distance learning class because the philosophy of education section that I was teaching had to be canceled. Or you might just be interested. And so we're all kind of in this for different reasons, and we're all kind of explorers. First time folks who are using this format and this venue that's just really getting underway. And so we have an opportunity to experiment with it as well as to define the terms and to see what works and what doesn't work. So this semester, like I said, it's only the second time, so I just did it first in January, that we are exploring the possibilities of the Google Plus Hangout. I'm sure that there will be emerging different formats for interactive online real-time, but I'm really excited to try this, and I'm really looking forward to it. We'll also be using some of the more traditional distance learning online sort of platforms for the course, and that is Blackboard. Hopefully everybody's familiar with Blackboard. It's a widely used software at universities, and essentially what you need to do is you log into the Hofstra portal, and when in a tab in the top of the screen, you'll see Blackboard. You click that, it opens up, and it will show our course FDED 252. You click that, and in you go, and you'll find the syllabus there, all the course documents, including the readings, as well as lectures that have been recorded. I'm not entirely sure if I can link up these lectures to Blackboard. I don't know that I could do it. It's so new to me that I haven't actually tried to do that yet, so we'll see. If not, I'll be sending these to you as a link that you can open up. They'll also be saved at my YouTube channel, Eduardo Duarte. So if you subscribe to the channel, you can just see these lectures there as well. But in Blackboard, you will be also using what's called the discussion board. Again, most of you are familiar with that. And that's what we'll be having more of the traditional style of online interaction, where you will be posting questions and responding to other student questions in response to the readings and the lectures. And so the week-to-week process will be something like we'll have an assigned reading. You will listen to a lecture that's associated with the reading. Some of the lectures I'll be importing from FDED 200, the Intro to Philosophy class, and I'll talk about that in a moment when I talk a little bit more about the course content as to why I'm doing that. So some of those lectures we're going to talk about the philosophical educator, which for our context concerns is the educator who is thinking, and we'll talk about what that is in a moment. And you'll be listening to the lecture, completing the reading, and then posting a question. Just one important question that you want to explore and have other people explore. And then once all the questions are posted, you will be responding to one another in discussion board. We'll then collect all that, the data, I suppose you could put it, the results of the discussion, and I'll go through them, and then our Google Plus Hangout seminar, which will be the following Monday. So the open discussions will conclude on Fridays, and then we'll take the weekend to review everything, and then on Monday evening we will have our seminar where we'll debrief on what people wrote and have a follow-up conversation. So that's the process, and hopefully everybody is will get into the full swing of that. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. Now, in terms of the course content, I've already mentioned that I'll be drawing on the material that I've developed over the 18 years that I've been teaching this course, the Intro to Philosophy of Education. And over the last couple of years, as I started to teach that course as a distance learning class, I really started to focus on and develop what I call the philosophical educator. In the course overview for the Intro to Philosophy of Education, I described that the course as not being an introduction to the philosophy of education, but an introduction to the way that philosophy educates. And the way that philosophy educates is the particular concern of that course, and the one who is orchestrating or mediating or setting up the conditions for the possibility of a philosophical education is a persona that I call the philosophical educator. In a book that I wrote called Being and Learning, I talk a lot about this philosophical educator, and I use deliberately a term from ancient philosophy called the sage. Now, the philosophical educator in our context and the philosophical educator in our context in this course in Ethics for Educators is very important because it is the persona and the process, but I prefer to use the persona, who risks thinking. And I say risk thinking because today in education it's increasingly become the case that to think is to take a risk. And by that I mean in the sense of taking a leap. Soren Kierkegaard talks about the leap of faith, and Martin Heidegger then talks about the spring, the jump that one needs to take into thinking. In this sense, we could talk about taking a leap or springing into thinking as a kind of a risk, because in the context that we're in education today, it's not necessarily the case that the conditions or the ground, let's say, that we are moving on is hospitable to thinking. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the course is going to be an actual exploration of that thesis, that the ground upon which we are moving in education today isn't necessarily hospitable, or to use an agricultural metaphor, isn't rich in the nutrients to allow us to cultivate thinking in education. So that's our thesis, and we can ask, well, why is that important? Well, following Hannah Arendt, I'm suggesting that the question of ethics in education, which is the question that this course is organized around, is a question of thinking in education. For Arendt, as she outlines in the introduction to the first volume of Life of the Mind, which is entitled Thinking, the matter of ethics turns on the question of thinking. Maybe I should read from that. So on page 5 in the introduction to Life of the Mind, the first volume, Thinking, Arendt says, "The question that imposed itself and that imposes itself upon us is, could the activity of thinking as such, the habit of examining whatever happens to come to pass or to attract attention, regardless of results and specific content, could this activity be among the conditions that make us abstain from evil doing, or even actually condition them against it?" So her question is, could thinking be the activity among the conditions that make us abstain from evil doing, or actually condition against it? Now, the question, of course, is what for Arendt would be evil doing, and what would be the thing, for lack of a better word, that thinking conditions us against? Well, very straightforwardly, it's unthinking. Well, what is unthinking, and why is this, for Arendt, evil doing? Now, this is where, in her introduction, and I would ask you to look at this, Arendt has made a very important observation, and one that I want to also make with a story or an anecdote of something that happened very recently to me at our institution. For Arendt, unthinking is manifested in behavior, which is to say, in human movement in the world that is the result not of agency, but of following orders, taking directions, moving according to a script, and therefore it's devoid of any responsibility. So the famous example that what led her to this discovery was her attending of the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Adolf Eichmann was one of the principals of the Holocaust in the Nazi era. And he was brought to trial in Jerusalem. Now, Arendt was very critical of the trial, and she was very critical of many things, but she discovered in observing and being a participant at this trial that the thing that made Eichmann evil wasn't the results of his action, which were horrible. Right? It was the Holocaust, the genocide. It wasn't the crimes against humanity that emerged as a result of what he did. The real evil that Eichmann manifested was his lack of thought, his utter thoughtlessness. That when he was presenting his defense, he was presenting it as a dutiful bureaucrat. I was simply following orders. I was doing my duty. I was carrying out my work. And whatever happened after I did my job, which was to organize the rounding up of Jews to put them on trains that then led them to the concentration camps. His job, he said, was merely to do that. What happened after that was not his responsibility. He was told to perform a function. He was carrying out his duty. That was it. He was not responsible for what was happening at the other end. For Arendt, Eichmann's firm belief that this was a defense and that his actions were not wrong because they were justified within the context of a logic, of a system that he was participating in, but which he had no say in, was the manifestation of what she called the banality of evil. This is unthinking as evil. So for us today, we are faced with a situation that is not as grave as the situation in Nazi Germany, but it has and operates under a very analogous logic, and that is the logic of unthinking. Arendt warned us that the reason that thinking is something that needs to be protected, it needs to be cultivated, it needs to be expected and demanded of everyone is because its absence produces the situation in which it's possible that human beings become unhuman in the sense that they stop thinking, which is to say that they stop taking responsibility. And in a very straightforward, commonsensical way, we all know that the question of ethics is a question of responsibility, of taking responsibility for what one has done, of owning, right? Now, for Arendt and for us, what we're concerned about and what we are exploring and what's in the background and what is part of really the thesis is that we are in a situation in education today where processes, systems, structures have been set up that don't allow us to take responsibility. So even if we want to take responsibility, in a certain sense, we are unable or disempowered from doing that. So we have this structural problem that we need to address, as well as we have the philosophical problem that we're exploring, which is, what does it mean to think? That's really our concern in this course. And that's my concern. It's not to demonstrate or to prove the structural problem that we have, that is to say, the conditions that are inhospitable to thinking, that have disempowered us, and I'm going to give this example of what I'm talking about in a moment, that have disempowered us from thinking. That's there, and we experience it. And I'm going to give an example in a moment of how that's so palatable in my own life and my own professional experience in education. However, the challenge I think that Arendt has given us, and what her book, her first volume of The Life of the Mind of Thinking is all about, is that may be the case. But what we're called to do is to understand what is thinking, as she puts it in her introduction. Where are we when we are thinking? What are we doing when we are thinking? So our concern in the course is going to be to look at thinking as manifesting itself in different ways, thinking as appearing in the world in different ways. So on the one hand, Arendt talks about thinking as a conversation, she says, borrowing from Plato, a silent dialogue I have with myself. But thinking is an activity that appears in the world. How does it appear in the world? Well, following Arendt, I'm suggesting that thinking appears in the world through judging, which is not to say or confuse it with the activity of being judgmental. It's often confused. Judging is the exercise of the faculty of thinking in the world. So thinking is the activity that happens when I have a silent dialogue with myself. Judging is the manifestation of thinking, which is another way of saying that who we are, to use Arendt's language, is disclosed in the world through judging. Now, the word judging may create some confusion because it's so closely linked to being judgmental. So I would want to talk more about disclosure of the self as the way in which thinking appears in the world. Now, thinking appears in the world through self-disclosure in the ways that we interact with others. So our focus in this class is going to be very much about the ways in which who we are appears in relationship to others, in the ways that we listen, in the ways that we express ourselves, in the ways that we attune to the other, so that the actions, if we can call them that manifest who we are coming into the world in our relationships with one another and the world. And this is precisely the thing that we'll be exploring in this course. Because if thinking conditions us against becoming irresponsible, or put positively, if thinking disclosed in the world or appearing in the world is a manifestation of our taking responsibility, then this responsibility takes on the form of being able to own who we are in relationship to the world and to others. And that's the essence of being an ethical person. That's the essence of our ethical persona. It's our capacity to take responsibility for who we are and to define, characterize who we are in relationship to others. So the course is going to really be about this. It's going to be an exploration of both the ethical educator as a certain particular attempt by an educator to take responsibility for both who they are in relationship to the world, to the students, to the work they do, to their school or university, to their community, and also, and insofar as they're doing that, cultivating or creating the conditions for the possibility of others taking responsibility. So creating a space for thinking is creating a space for the possibility of ethical responsibility. So the question of ethics and education comes down to the ability or capacity of the educator to bring about with others the conditions for the possibility of responsibility, which is another way of saying of allowing for thinking to appear in the world. Now, the matter is one of, well, how does that come about? That's what we'll be exploring in this course, because there are different ways in which this happens, and through our readings we'll be exploring just how what I'm calling the moral authority, that is to say, taking responsibility or thinking in the world, how that comes into being in different ways. So through reading different philosophers who have attempted to answer this question, we'll see different ways in which thinking can appear in the world, and how this applies or how this relates to education. Now I want to end with a story of how recently this situation really became very, very clear to me. And it was just recently that I started to teach the spring semester, and I was teaching a course, my first class in the Introduction to the Philosophy of Education. And for circumstances that are beyond my control and beyond the students' control, we have the need to have more than one section of this course, and to ensure that there are enough sections for faculty to teach. It's an economic and political situation, if you will. That's fine. But here's the problem, and here's the story. As I was teaching this course, started to teach it, in the very beginning of it, I was about 5 minutes into it, I was teaching the class, and I turned away for a moment from the class of students and was turning towards the computer where I was working to present slides that we were going through as a way of thinking through the introducing the material that we were going to be studying. And I through the peripheral vision, a student or a body came into the room, and I just presumed it was a student that was arriving a couple minutes late. Well, when I looked up, it turned out that it wasn't a student. After all, it was a member of the staff. And the member of the staff who didn't just walked into the room unannounced and quietly went right to where I was standing, had a list, and from that list announced to the group that there were a number of students that would have to get up and leave to follow her to, ironically, or the basement where they would have to join the other section because there were too few students in that course and they needed to raise the numbers. Now, I don't want to get into too many of the specifics on this, but the matter here was that when I asked and in a subtle way protested this action, I was told that it was happening because a decision had been made. Now, rather than get into a whole dramatic scene, because it would have been a bit of a drama with this member of the staff, I simply thought to myself, well, I wasn't part of this decision. I wasn't part of this conversation that led to this decision, and the decision was being made for the students without any consultation on their part and any consultation from me. The students had no choice. They were forced, the three of them that were called from the list, to leave the room and to proceed along with the staff member to the other section. Again, I didn't call attention to this, although I wanted to because the class is just beginning, but I'm calling attention to it here because it relates specifically to the problem at hand that we're dealing with in this course that we're taking up. And that is that the member of the staff had no responsibility in the decision making or that led to the removal of the students and the placing them against their knowledge or desire or will in the other section. She was simply doing her job. The follow-up was for me to reflect on this and to say, and to call attention to the fact that there was no consultation, there was no one taking responsibility. In fact, this is the really important part for what had happened. The students, at least one of them, protested, and rightly so. They hadn't been told ahead of time. They weren't given the right of refusal. And in effect, they were being undermined. Their power, I would argue, that goes all the way back to the beginnings of the university and its inception in Bologna in the 12th century. This right of the student to choose who they're going to be studying with was completely relinquished, taken away from them. The conditions then are quite the same as Arendt is talking about. The students were unable to exercise their responsibility for being students, that is to say, to choose what class they were going to take, what section they were going to take. Myself, the faculty member, was disempowered. I wasn't brought into the conversation. I wasn't given warning. I was made party to a situation that I had no part in. And the representative, the member of the staff, was performing a function or a role that she was informed that she had to do. She also had no part in the decision making or the rationale behind it. My job is to move students from one part of the building to another. Why that's the case, or the reason behind that, I have nothing to do with. I'm just doing my job. Now, this is real, and when it's happening at a university, you can imagine that for it to happen in schools, K through 12, would just be thought of as part of the way things are. Because, again, what's the issue here is that students aren't seen as thinkers. They aren't seen as, and viewed, at least in this case, as agents with will, right, and the desire to choose between one or the other. And this goes all the way down, and it's problematically so because in the state-organized education, students it's compulsory. You have to go to school, right? Which it's not really part of the debate, but it's the way in which the sense of the compulsory and the logic of the compulsory is taken to such an extreme where it undermines the student's ability to exercise any kind of right, any kind of freedom, any kind of thinking. So that's the example of a very recent event, and it's really something I want you to keep in the back of your mind, and perhaps I'll return to that, and perhaps we'll talk about it at our first Google Hangout. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. I'm looking forward to this course very much. I'm looking forward to exploring philosophers that I have been working on for many years in this context, in this moment, with you, in this case for the first time, and also to be experimenting with this exciting new technologies and softwares that we're being put into use. So look forward to working with all of you, and I will see you at the first Google Hangout.